One of the greatest legends the stage has ever seen is Madonna, the unstoppable queen of pop, who gave the world the hits Like a Virgin and Like a Prayer, as well as an entire universe of reinvention. She is more than just an artist. She is a warrior who rewrote the rules of music, image, and bravery. She is a revolution in both flesh and sound. She has worn the crown of brilliance, carried the flame of defiance, and endured the enormous burden of being the most successful female artist in history for decades. The tragic loss at the age of 5, the harsh hand of fate, and the moment she faced death itself, however, tore apart her soul beneath the glory and the records. Anyone else might have been broken by these storms, but she got back up and let her voice resound louder than the agony. And now, at age 67, a silent storm more powerful than all the others is arising, shrouding her once dazzling splendor in darkness and revealing a wound never before seen, a secret suffering that leaves everyone gasping, wondering what shadows haunt Madonna in her final years. In order to honor the woman who transformed suffering into an enduring legacy, please remember to like and leave a red heart in the comments section if her voice has ever had an impact on your life. It is devastating to realize that beneath Madonna's glittering crown of glory, her story starts with a cruel loss and a wound that is never fully healed. What happens if a child who is meant to make history is deprived of the one love she most needs and is forced to face the dark too soon? Madonna Louise Ciccone, the third of 6 children born to a working-class Catholic family in Bay City, Michigan, was born on August 16, 1958. Her mother, Madonna Fortin, was a dedicated housewife, and her father, Silvio, was a strict engineer. Even though there was tradition and order, the house was always packed, the faith was strict, and money was always scarce. Nevertheless, until 1963, when everything fell apart, there was warmth even in that small house, the cadence of family meals and hushed prayers. The 5-year-old Madonna was left staring at a coffin she could not understand, a silence so heavy it roared through every hallway like a storm that would never pass after the mother who kept the family together was struck by breast cancer and taken far too soon. She was only 5 years old when she felt the world fall apart. Security replaced by echoes, warmth replaced by absence, and a haven transformed into a prison of unanswered prayers. Once clinging to her mother's arms, the young girl now only reached for shadows. And that absence was more than just a loss. It was a cruel hand from fate that permanently marked her as a traitor. In 1966, her father, who was broken and in need of stability, remarried the housekeeper. As though love itself had left and locked the door behind her, young Madonna felt misplaced, misinterpreted, and pushed to the periphery of her own family instead of being comforted. With the birth of 2 half-siblings from this second marriage, the household became even more crowded. Despite the fact that the house was crowded with kids, Madonna felt more isolated than ever, a stranger in her own home. Warmth was limited and tension was perpetual with her new stepmother. Every action served as a reminder that the love she so desperately sought would never return, and she felt even more alone because of the distance between them. The household was subject to stricter Catholic discipline. She learned to sit motionless with longing, to pray for strength rather than miracles, and to hide her tears behind an unblinking gaze that already knew what adults could not say in the pews of solemn churches, as rules increased and tenderness decreased. As if looking for a stolen star that might reappear in the night sky, she would later admit years later that she spent a large portion of her life looking for her mother in other women's faces, gestures, and brief acts of kindness. She was surrounded by her siblings but also felt isolated from them, watching the hum of a house that had moved on without its heart. She then turned inward and found the one thing that would never betray her: the ferocious pulse of rhythm, the hidden power of movement, and the secret language of music that could convey what words could never. She practiced her survival in the empty rooms, transforming cramped quarters into hidden stages, obstinate breathing into hushed prayers, and suffering into defiance. She taught herself to create comfort if it could not be provided. Love must be changed if it cannot be found, and she would respond with a sound that shook the walls if she felt that silence was about to crush her. The same cruel question was asked every day. Would she overcome grief or would it break her? And she responded every day by strengthening her will, nourishing her creativity, and having the courage to scale the barriers that dictated her identity and enter a realm where she was free to make her own decisions. She discovered during those years that survival is a war, not a passive one, before the wound itself became the catalyst for her disobedience. The child who had been denied her mother's mercy forged a warrior's armor by weaving courage into art and discipline into discipline. She grabbed the pen and swore to write every subsequent chapter with fire if loss had been the story's original author. She vowed to raise her voice until ceilings cracked and everyone was forced to listen, if silence had attempted to take it. Therefore, her legend did not start with lights, cheers, or celebrity. It started with a coffin and silence, with a sorrow that would not go away and a spirit that would not die, a spirit that would one day transform an empty room into a global stage and an aching heart into songs that everyone on the planet would hear and never forget. What occurs when a child who was raised in silence chooses to respond to the world through sound? The coffin that took her mother away was not the end of Madonna's childhood grief. She was forced out of Michigan and into the clutches of New York City by the fire. She had already trained her spirit like a fighter and her body like a soldier before she left. After she diligently studied ballet as a teenager and was awarded a scholarship to the University of Michigan, her mentor, Christopher Flynn, told her, "You don't belong here. New York is where you belong. Your fate awaits you there." Thus, in 1978, when she was just 19 years old, she boarded a one-way ticket to a city known for gulping down dreamers with just $35 in her pocket. She was running toward fate, daring it to either make her or break her, not away from home. However, the New York she discovered was a battlefield rather than a promising skyline. She was robbed in her first few days, stripped of what little she had and left to face the concrete jungle alone. She lay hungry, scared, and completely alone in her dilapidated East Village apartment, while the Broadway lights glittered outside her window. She later admitted, "New York wasn't everything I thought it would be. The first year was the most difficult. My apartment was broken into 3 times and I was robbed and assaulted. However, I never considered returning." She spent every night in a room that echoed with emptiness in a city that was ablaze with possibilities. It was a paradox. At times, she fell asleep with hunger roiling through her body rather than dreams, and her stomach would growl louder than the subway beneath her feet. She performed all the tasks necessary for survival. She cleaned floors, waited tables, acted as a model for an artist, and danced until her muscles ached. Every meal was earned with shame, and every dollar was purchased with fatigue. But each humiliation made her resolve stronger. Hunger for recognition, hunger for food, and hunger for a life beyond survival all came together to form one. She would later remark, "I felt like I had everything to gain, so I had nothing to lose." And she persevered with that belief. Nevertheless, the world rejected her. She was fired by record executives. She was questioned by musicians. The girl with too much ambition and too little polish was mocked by critics. However, rejection taught her, not silenced her. Every door that was slammed served as a practice for resiliency, and every joke made about her served as a lesson in defiance. In small bands like Breakfast Club and Emmy, she played guitar, drums, and provided backing vocals, not as the lead, but as a sound student. She shaped herself into an artist piece by piece in dimly lit rehearsal spaces, absorbing every error, chord, and rhythm. It was not a glamorous affair. It was hard, unseen labor. However, something ferocious was developing in the shadows, a storm for which the world was unprepared. The city disciplined her but showed her no mercy. She created dances in small spaces during restless nights, transforming loneliness into melody and hunger into rhythm. She taught herself that art was oxygen, not decoration, and practiced survival as well as steps in broken mirrors. Even though her voice cracked, her body shook, and her feet blistered, she persisted. She practiced for life itself rather than for praise, because giving up would mean giving in to the silence she had vowed to break. Then, in 1982, there was a break brought on by boldness and desperation. Mark Cammons heard something indisputable when Madonna forced her demo song, Everybody, into the hands of club DJs. The audience roared when he performed it at Danceteria. Seymour Stein, the head of Sire Records, who was coincidentally recuperating from heart surgery in a hospital bed, was introduced to her by Cammons. Unflinching, Madonna strode into that hospital room and made her voice heard. She later recalled, "I would have done anything, anywhere, just to be heard." The door that had been slammed so many times finally opened that day when destiny blinked. By 1983, Madonna, her self-titled debut album, did more than just make its way onto the radio. It exploded across the night sky like a flare. Holiday, Lucky Star, and Borderline weren't songs. They were battle cries encased in melody, survival anthems. Strangers who had never heard her name now yelled it from arenas, and critics who had previously laughed now rushed to explain her. 5 years of hunger, rejection, and defiance were echoed in every beat, until the $35 that rattled in her pocket became a storm, strong enough to rock the foundations of pop music itself. Her success was not the result of luck or privilege. It was honed by isolation, forged in suffering, and let loose by an iron will. She transformed silence into song, rejection into revolution, and poverty into power. This was no typical climb. It was a survivor's roar, one that would not be broken. The young girl who used to stand at her mother's coffin had constructed a stage so large that everyone on the planet had to watch her dance on it. The legend of Madonna didn't start with cheers. It started with loss, hunger, and the decision to stand up when everything seemed to be working against her. The world did more than simply listen when she eventually opened her mouth to sing. It bowed to the arrival of the Queen of Pop. Her name was first spoken in whispers to the world. However, Madonna was no longer a whisper by 1984. She was a blast. Like a virgin exploded all over the world, scandalous and unstoppable, making a Michigan girl the most talked about woman in the world. Clad in lace and bedecked in defiance, she danced her way into the cultural mainstream and onto the charts. This was a coronation, not just a hit. Madonna became the Queen of Pop overnight, and she was no longer just Madonna. The world was in disbelief. While some praised her, others decried her. She aroused as much indignation as admiration, and she welcomed both. She once said, "Art should be controversial." Every shock was oxygen, and every scandal was another breach in the wall. Like a Prayer, released in 1989, split history in two, faith and desire colliding, sacred icons on fire. Politicians were furious, pulpits thundered, and contracts were canceled. However, the song was a hit, and the rage only made her more legendary. She was an empire by the 1990s, not just a celebrity. Stadiums became temples of defiance as her concerts became pilgrimages, and the Immaculate Collection cemented her rule. Every record that the industry believed was untouchable was rewritten by her. She refused to remain motionless, though, even at her best. With a Golden Globe, Evita silenced her detractors. In the digital age, Ray of Light revealed a spirit seeker. She was thrown back into the throne of midnight by confessions on a dance floor. She declared, "I am my own experiment. I am an artistic creation of my own." Reinvention was survival, not luxury. However, each transformation came with a scar. Her face, body, and years were all dissected by the world. She was labeled desperate, while men her age were hailed as timeless. No crown was as deep sunk as that hypocrisy. Triumph was never mercy, but her tours became legendary. The triumph felt like a cage of gold even in 2024, when she performed in front of 1.6 million people in Rio de Janeiro. "It's a very lonely place at the top," she admitted. Millions of people cheered her on as she entered hotel rooms where silence was more forceful than cheers. To keep an eye on a body harmed by decades of practice and injuries, doctors accompanied her on her journey. Although she grinned for the cameras, her spirit was stumbling. Her legs hurt and her joints throbbed off stage. She reveled beneath the confetti before collapsing alone, the crown still shining but heavier, sharper, and piercing deeper each year. The world bowed, headlines declaring her the greatest innumerable titles, and the Hall of Fame. The harsh reality that legends are still human was carried by a woman who was bleeding silently behind the lights. There is more to her story than records and tours. The harsh cost of wearing a crown that never comes off is the subject of this story. Madonna transformed silence into anthems, rejection into revolution, and suffering into power. Even the strongest crown can break its wearer one day, and even the fiercest spirit bleeds. A truth that lingered like thunder before the storm as she stood at the pinnacle of fame. However, another Madonna moved silently behind the lights. She was the architect as well as the artist. She and Time Warner co-founded Maverick in 1992, a $60 million venture that changed the role of women in business. She published the notorious book Sex that same year. It was denounced and outlawed but quickly devoured, transforming scandal into a new rebellion's tenets. Her face moved from stage to storefront to boardroom, from mass-market ads to couture houses, from Material Girl and Truth or Dare to her MDNA skin venture. Evidence that even her image had turned into a business. However, each crown has a weight. The air grew thinner as she ascended higher. The same question was raised by every contract, dispute, and reinvention. Was she creating a cage of gold or a throne? The ledgers were bursting with the thunderous applause. However, the demand was harsh. Never break, be bolder, and be louder. No costume could conceal the marks the crown left behind. Loneliness behind sequins, exhaustion behind encores, vulnerability behind veils of power, as it glittered under the spotlight and pressed harder in the dark. She acknowledged that there were nights when the victory felt like lock and key, celebrated by millions paying the price alone. This is her reign's paradox. Untouchable on stage, a queen subverting culture. Off stage, the symbol and the target simultaneously adored and accused. The girl who used to hold $35 now runs a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And with every triumph came fresh invisible wounds, silent evidence of exhaustion, self-sacrifice, and the never-ending desire to live forever. Her story is the price of wearing a crown that never comes off, not a ledger of records. Madonna transformed silence into anthems, rejection into revolution, and suffering into power. Fire could be seen all over the world as she stood at the top, as a reminder that even the most fierce spirit suffers in silence and that even the most brilliant crown can eventually leave its mark on its wearer. The shadows lengthen at the heights where the lights are brightest. However, destiny had already written a darker chapter years before, when Madonna entered a love story at the age of 27 that would burn as brightly as her fame and collapse just as violently, even as the world declared her unstoppable. In addition to being the queen of pop, Madonna was a woman in love when she stood at an altar in 1985. Sean Penn, the erratic celebrity who had captivated her with an irresistible and reckless force, was standing next to her. It seemed as though fate had written their story in flames when they first met months prior, on the set of her Material Girl music video. The world's most fearless pop star and Hollywood's wild prince sealed their vows in front of millions of onlookers during their wedding, which was a spectacle for the ages, and was besieged by helicopters flying like vultures in the Malibu sky. She appeared to have found her anchor, her equal at that precise moment. "I thought we could conquer the world together," she once admitted candidly. However, what the world hailed as a fairy tale quickly descended into tragedy. Passion turned into conflict behind closed doors. Madonna's unrelenting rise and Sean's jealous outburst clashed, and the very intensity that held them together started to burn them alive. Love dissolved into accusations, and what started out as whispers of devotion became nights of yelling silence. They were golden to the cameras. They were prisoners of a love that had turned into a war zone in their own home. In retrospect, Madonna would acknowledge, "We were both so young, too fiery, and it was combustible." The media swung around like raptors, with tabloids consuming every rumor and exaggerating every flaw. Every altercation turned into a news story, and every look was turned into a scandal. The spotlight revealed her wounds rather than protecting them. The walls had closed in by 1987. The Malibu home that was supposed to be their refuge turned into a stormy and suspicious cage. When love started to fall apart, there were no kids to cushion the blows or a common bond to hold them together, just tiredness and broken promises reverberating through the quiet of mornings following countless nights of fighting. The disparity was intolerable. In adoration, stadiums roared her name. However, she returned to a marriage that was crumbling under its own weight after the music ended. In her own home, she was a woman drowning in love that felt more like a prison sentence, despite being known as the Queen of Pop to the rest of the world. Years later, she confided, "Sean was the love of my life." This was not a rejection of the chaos, but rather an acknowledgement that the scar caused by that love would never go away. It was the scar and the lingering thought of what could have been. It ended in 1989 after 4 years that seemed like 40. What started out as a coronation turned into a warning. Madonna saw her marriage to Sean Penn as a crucible, rather than merely a failed love. It taught her that love that promises heaven but delivers hell can break even the strongest spirit. Even as the world hailed Madonna as the unstoppable queen of pop in the mid-1990s, she secretly yearned for something that praise could never provide. A love free from cameras. A tenderness powerful enough to still the clamor. She unexpectedly discovered it in Carlos Leon, a fitness trainer of Cuban descent whose unflinching devotion and grounded calm seemed to give her the tenderness that fame had so frequently denied. Their worlds couldn't have been more dissimilar. His was a simple life, hers a stage of dazzling lights. However, it felt more like fate than chance when their paths crossed in 1995, giving her a brief reprieve. The controversial firebrand rebel finally showed her vulnerability, falling for a man who was attracted to the woman rather than the icon. Her first real miracle came in 1996 when her daughter, Lourdes Maria, was born during that brief period of peace. At the age of 38, Madonna finally held the love she had been seeking her entire life. A connection that no crown, no chart, and no audience could ever match. Being a mother changed everything, she later admitted. I no longer lived for myself. The circle of pain broke in that moment for the child who had lost her own mother at the age of 5. Lourdes became her compass and her beacon of hope, demonstrating that Madonna could establish her own haven of love despite the clamor of fame. However, the gift of love was encased in fragility. Her relationship with Carlos ended in 1997 because it was too fragile to withstand the pull of her celebrity. She was once again alone, not just as a woman but now as a mother after what had started out as a loving haven fell apart. Madonna in a dim nursery, rocking her baby to sleep with one hand while wiping away silent tears with the other, was the reality behind the world-favorite image of her dazzle millions under spotlights. It was a triumphant and tragic portrait. Love had given her the daughter she had always desired, but it had left her again before they could start the family she had always imagined. Her fortitude, however, would not give up. Across continents, she carried Lourdes with her, juggling nights of lullabies sung in the dark with arenas full of thunderous applause. Perfection was a requirement of fame. Everything else was demanded by motherhood, and Madonna fostered both despite her loneliness and exhaustion, continuing to cling to the flimsy hope that she would eventually find a father for her daughter, as well as a partner for herself. She thought she had finally found the man who could make her broken haven a real home when she walked down the aisle again in 2000, this time with renowned British filmmaker Guy Ritchie. Madonna had experienced a decade of turmoil by the late 1990s, including failed relationships, the humiliating spotlight of celebrity, and the loneliness of raising her 1996 child, Lourdes, almost alone. Under the stage lights, millions of people witnessed the Queen of Pop at her height. Behind the curtains, however, she was muttering a different prayer, not for another hit song or headline, but for something basic, brittle, and human: a home. When friends in London introduced her to Guy Ritchie in 1999, the witty British director whose grounded charm felt like the antidote to her chaos, that hope appeared. He was more than just a man to Madonna. He was a promise of stability, of fatherhood for Lourdes, of a future in which she could finally give up her crown without worrying that it would be taken. Their union was like something out of a contemporary fairy tale. On December 22, 2000, Madonna, who was 42 at the time, entered a centuries-old castle in the isolated Scottish town of Dornoch, clad in white silk and carrying the flimsy hope that this time love would endure. In the chilly winter air, villagers gathered, desperate to catch a glimpse of destiny being sealed. The Queen of Pop finding her king, helicopters thundered overhead. Guy stood waiting inside under the flickering candlelight, his smile silent and comforting. The crown she wore was invisible for once. The softer dream of belonging took its place. The happiness that ensued was real. When their son Rocco was born in August of that year, Madonna's world appeared to be temporarily complete. Guy was holding her hand while Lourdes was on one side and Rocco was on the other. They welcomed David, a child who represented love that transcended boundaries, from Malawi in 2006. For a brief moment, the woman who had been abandoned as a young child thought she had broken the cycle and created the family she had always wanted. In interviews, she said, "I feel like I have a home," for the first time, her voice softer than the stage ever permitted. During those years, she found her greatest joy not in the noise of stadiums, but in the silence of bedtime stories, breakfast table laughter, and gardens filled with children's footsteps. As though fate had finally given in, the portrait was rendered with warmth and tranquility. However, every fairy tale has a dark side, and the first cracks were already waiting to show up, even in that castle of joy. But love was cruel once more. The strain of two worlds colliding caused what had started as a sanctuary to gradually crumble. Guy, a traditionalist, yearning for a more stable, peaceful orbit, and Madonna, unrelenting in her reinvention, a comet that would not go out. Their differences initially felt like balance, his grounded humor to her electric drive, her velocity to his stillness. It worked for a time. The edges of fame are softened by walks down country lanes, London evenings by the fireplace, and children's laughter. However, what at first seemed to be complimentary eventually became antagonistic, like a storm pounding on a stone. The roar of arena spotlights was too loud for London pubs to control. The roar of international tours was too loud for country homes to muffle. Film sets required patience. Stadiums called for rage. Arguments became more heated. The silences grew longer. One yearned for seclusion. The other would never be able to fully escape a public life. Time zones changed when it came to bedtimes. Rehearsals took the place of family dinners. Additionally, the term normal itself turned into a losing bargain. The Scottish castle where they had made their lifelong vows started to lose its warmth. The people in the pictures of the hallway smiled back, but they didn't say much. Once filled with children's laughter, the kitchen now reverberated with the oppressive quiet of distance. The fairy tale vanished in 2008, dissolved into a sour divorce. The headlines were filled with numbers ranging from $66 to $80 million. But the real cost, the shattering of the house she had spent her entire life fighting to create, could not be quantified by any settlement. Years later, in 2016, at the age of 16, their son Rocco suffered the most severe wound. Private suffering was brought into the spotlight. Under the ruthless spotlight of tabloids, a custody battle played out, with each headline further twisting the knife. This was the one stage where Madonna lacked the control and choreography that had made her empire. Courtrooms turned into makeshift theaters, lawyers were reluctant co-stars, and the main focus was not a job or a contract, but rather her child, her flesh and blood, and her decision to put distance before intimacy. "It was the hardest thing I've ever gone through," she said, her voice breaking. Only two houses, two truths, and a boy torn between them were present. There were no villains. Images of paparazzi flashing, doors closing, and faces against the wind were broadcast to the world. The quiet of a mother's room at night was something it missed. Unanswered calls and a phone that was face down because it was too painful to look at. A suitcase that was only partially packed for a flight she wasn't sure she should take. Prayers for patience, mercy, and a love that is powerful enough to mend what courts and news headlines cannot, were whispered into a pillow. The delicate threads within her own family, rather than the outside world, brought the woman who had resisted censorship, questioned establishments, and withstood decades of scrutiny to her knees. It wasn't the weight of the crown or the cost of fame. Learning that even the strongest love must yield, and that sometimes clinging to someone requires learning to let go, was the cost of being human. This turned out to be the most severe wound for Madonna. The quiet devastation and quiet dignity of a mother's love were put to the test in ways no stage could ever prepare her for. It wasn't a scandal or a headline. However, her home was not the only place where she experienced pain. In addition to the shattered marriage and motherhood, Madonna also suffered the gradual erasure of a whole generation in her wake. As her fame grew in the 1980s, the AIDS epidemic ravaged the very neighborhood that had given her the opportunity to perform. Dancers who used to spin next to her, designers who sewed her identity into the fabric. Rehearsal rooms were filled with the laughter of friends. Their lights went out one by one. Absence haunted studios that had once reverberated with sweat and music. Like ghosts of bodies that would never come back, costumes hung on racks. Being young and alive during those years meant that you had to deal with grief like a second skin, schedule funerals as if they were practice sessions, and feel as though an invisible war was going on with no end in sight. Later, in a voice laden with nostalgia, Madonna would admit, "I lost so many friends, so many people I loved." It seemed like a conflict. Her voice could reach millions of people, but it was unable to bring back the voices that had been silenced. One name that was etched in her heart was Jean-Michel Basquiat. Their brief, tumultuous, and flammable romance was like two meteors colliding too violently to orbit one another. Her walls were bare, but her memory was permanently painted with his fire. He gave her canvases life with rage and brilliance, then took them back when love fell apart. Before the world could truly appreciate Basquiat's genius, he was gone, engulfed in addiction a few years later. His passing meant more to Madonna than just losing a lover. It was the silence of an artist who, like her, made beauty out of suffering and dared the world to look. It was like watching a mirror break when she lost him. It was a reflection of her own stubbornness, vulnerability, and fire. She was forced to face a harsh reality that she could not ignore by the AIDS epidemic and Basquiat's decline. Talent is not unstoppable. Dreams by themselves cannot protect against death, and brilliance is no armor. From that destruction, Madonna made a commitment to speak for people who were unable to do so, and to transform sorrow into art and music that would live on in the memory of the world. The shadow of those lost years was present in every survival anthem and defiant performance, a silent reminder that memory itself can be an act of rebellion, and that silence is lethal. The most brutal losses, however, weren't always abrupt. They might also be unrelenting, gnawing day after day while remaining out of sight. Because Madonna suffered from a different kind of slow death, the deterioration of herself under scrutiny, while she lamented those who passed away too soon. Once her gleaming armor, fame had turned into a magnifying glass that examined every wrinkle, skin change, and breath she took. She was torn apart by the same people who had crowned her the Queen of Pop, as if her body were theirs. Silver hair and wrinkles were praised as wisdom, and men her age were praised as timeless. Her aging was paraded as failure, and she was ridiculed as desperate. No longer a word, ageism was a knife that was constantly pressed against her soul, creating wounds that no surgeon could heal. In a rare moment of openness, she acknowledged, "It's not the mirror that hurts. It's the knowledge that everyone is observing me in it." In front of mirrors that had turned into silent courts, the woman who had once redefined beauty and rebellion asked a question that no amount of applause could stop. How do you live when the world won't let you grow old? She eventually resorted to the very means that society required of her. The syringe and scalpel were offered as sacred artifacts of perpetual youth for cosmetic procedures. However, every promise had a drawback. As if heading to battle, she lay under sterile lights, letting strangers handle her body and slipping into anesthesia. Long after the cameras were removed, she woke up to swelling and purple-flowered bruises rather than relief. Her skin was scorched by each bandage. Every stitch was a reminder that despite her best efforts to protect herself, she had exposed her body to the same scrutiny from which she had battled her entire life. The whisper in her own mind, rather than physical pain, was the cruelest torment. By submitting to the very chains she had spent decades dismantling, had she betrayed herself? What was supposed to be armor turned into yet another jail. Her reflection no longer felt like her own, but rather like a mask that the world rightfully claimed. She would not, however, disappear. "Because of my age, people have always attempted to silence me. Because I'm a woman," she said. "But I'm not going to stop." Her disobedience was like fire. But shadows are also cast by fire. She faced mirrors that reflected not only her changed appearance, but also the spirits of people who never aged. The dancers, the friends, the lovers who died too young, in the quiet that followed stadium thunder. As if her body had become a memorial, she carried them in her scars. She realized that in a society that demands erasure, survival is not the absence of wounds, but rather the courage to display them. The paradox of her middle years was this. Cemeteries were carried inside the woman who used thunder to light arenas. There were wounds that no amount of reinvention could cover up for the legend who kept reinventing herself. And there was an unspoken truth in those wounds, not just for Madonna, but for all souls who have seen time etch itself into the mirror. Obedience is not beauty. Youth is not a commodity. Furthermore, dignity cannot be gauged by other people's looks. Millions of people saw their own reflection in her struggle, the universal fight to age gracefully in a society that penalizes it. And if her scars were a testament to pain, they also shone like medals, demonstrating that endurance is a radical triumph even in the face of the harshest scrutiny. But she was still being tested by life. A much darker trial awaited her beyond the judgment and the mirrors, the day her body betrayed her and pulled her to the brink of death. Madonna had already endured decades of hardships, including broken marriages, custody disputes, ageism's brutality, and the constant pressure to be unbreakable. Nothing could have prepared her or the world for the moment when her body finally betrayed her, even though she had thunder in her voice and cemeteries in her heart. She passed out on June 24, 2023. It was a sudden infection that brought her to the brink of death, not scandal or heartbreak. She was rushed to intensive care, where she lay unconscious with air being forced into her lungs by machines. Once able to roar over stadiums, the woman's voice was now unable to summon her own breath. The Queen of Pop was quiet for the first time in 40 years, and the world came to understand that even legends can disappear. Millions of people outside froze in terror, with timelines repeating the same request: Please, Madonna, don't abandon us. Social media transformed into a cathedral of prayer. Headlines for days read like draft obituaries. Was this the last time? Could something too little to see now defeat the woman who had stood up to presidents, popes, and discrimination? The scene inside was bleak. Her body was reduced to a battlefield of science and chance. With tubes, wires, and red and green pulsing monitors, physicians used medications to combat bacteria, hope to combat silence, and machines to combat time. Her children stood watch at her side, their faces etched with the fear of losing a mother too soon, a fear she had experienced as a child. And even though she was unconscious somewhere in the liminal space between darkness and light, one fear kept coming back to her. Will my kids suffer the same injury that I did? The contradiction was intolerable. She was unable to control her own pulse, despite having previously commanded 1.6 million souls in Rio. Now trembling on the verge of silence was the same body that had danced rebellions into existence. Under the sterile lights of the intensive care unit, fame, wealth, and power were all irrelevant. She wasn't the cultural earthquake or the queen of pop in that room. She was merely a woman, a mother, a frail body pleading to remain, with breathing tubes clamped like shackles against her throat. The hours passed slowly. Every time she tried to breathe, her chest ached. She gasped as if life itself had become a wound reopening as the ventilator tore at her throat. According to one insider, it was hour by hour, touch and go. Her manager acknowledged that they had braced themselves for heartbreaking headlines and had prepared for the worst. As though their unwavering devotion might keep her bound to life, fans gathered outside the hospital to sing her songs and light candles in vigil. Their voices were like a delicate rope thrown into the darkness. Then she opened her eyes, weak, scarred, but alive in defiance of the odds. Her children and the millions of people who shared their breaths with her were the ones who shared those first breaths. I thought I was going to die, she would later admit with disarming candor. But something changed during that near-death experience. In addition to having a scar, she came out of it determined to live more slowly, to hold on tighter, and to gauge time by the faces at her dinner table rather than by applause. In private, she acknowledged that her survival had humbled her and reduced her to the one thing that mattered. The prize is life itself. This was no act for a woman who had dedicated her life to transforming suffering into performance. It was the unvarnished truth. Even the strongest crowns are susceptible to slipping. Even the most intense flames can go out. The desire to rise again, however, can be stronger than any anthem, even in the dark. Her best performance took place in the intensive care unit, which evolved from a ward. A woman struggling to breathe without any lights, costumes, or choreography demonstrates that legends are not characterized by their invincibility, but rather by their bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. Thus, 2023 turned into the most vulnerable and successful period of her life. Madonna didn't just come back from illness. She came back from the edge with a scar that told every fan, mother, and aging soul, life is cruel, but as long as you're alive, you're not dead. There was no encore. It was resurrection. At the age of 67, Madonna is not only a living legend, but also one of the richest and most enduring figures in entertainment history. She is living evidence that greatness is not inherited. Rather, it is created brick by brick, risk by risk, and defiance by defiance. Her estimated net worth is approximately $850 million. One of the biggest personal empires ever created by a woman in music started with just $35 in her pocket when she first moved to New York. Stacking layers of song, stage, film, fashion, and business into a fortune that rivals the biggest names in entertainment. Each reinvention was not only artistic, but also financial architecture. Madonna built her empire through hunger, ambition, and unwavering willpower in a world where billionaires are typically born into privilege. Her real estate holdings resemble parts of a worldwide fairy tale. Her 26-room townhouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side, a brick and ivy-covered fortress with private gardens and garages that serve as reminders of permanence in the city that never sleeps, is at the center of it all. Her palace, Quinta do Relógio, is located in Crato, Portugal, across the Atlantic. It is a 19th-century mansion where history and modernity coexist, surrounded by legendary gardens and Atlantic winds. She has also sold other properties, including a $23 million home in California's Hidden Hills and a 1926 Spanish colonial mansion in Los Angeles with a timeless pool and rose gardens that once symbolized her triumphs. Every home served as more than just a place to stay. It served as a platform for a fresh performance in her life's theater. Her wealth extends well beyond the boundaries of stone. Madonna's art collection alone, which is estimated to be worth $100 million, is a gallery of genius and rebellion. The provocations of Damien Hirst, the restless visions of Picasso, the revolutionary brushstrokes of Rivera, and the raw tenacity of Frida Kahlo all hang not as awards but as reflections of her own rebellious spirit. Even her cars tell her story. The Mini Cooper talks about her London years juggling art, family, and reinvention. The vintage Datsun 280ZX recalls the tenacious beginnings of the 1980s, when dreams were her only source of energy. And the Range Rover Sport, a sleek and powerful symbol of momentum that never stops, carries her forward today. Beyond music, there is her empire, which includes her luxury skincare brand MDNA Skin, which was born in Japan and has since spread throughout the world. MG Icon, which is a fashion and lifestyle business, and her countless partnerships with Dolce & Gabbana, H&M, and other brands. For Madonna, creativity and commerce were inextricably linked. It was a different language, a different performance, and a different way for her to claim her name. She created industries rather than just filling arenas. Not only did she set new records, but she also changed the definition of power for a woman who used to have nothing but fire in her chest. This goes beyond simply having money. It is evidence that someone who started out without a safety net, privilege, or inheritance can rise to create an empire that the rest of the world cannot ignore. But despite their brilliance, money and material belongings are nothing compared to what she values most: her kids. David, 20, adopted from Malawi; Mercy, 19, twins Esther and Stella, 17, Rocco, 25, her son with Guy Ritchie; and Lourdes, 28, born out of her love for Carlos Leon. Each of them symbolizes not only a phase of her life but also a decision that was occasionally motivated by passion, heartache, or her unwavering will to provide a home where none existed. They serve as the cornerstone of her empire rather than as decorations. When she lay in critical care in 2023 and almost passed out, it was their faces that lingered at her bedside. She was not the queen of pop at the time, devoid of wealth and fame, but merely a mother. And her kids feared that she was fading away because she had lost her own mother when she was 5 years old. She was changed and scarred by that fear. Not only did the intensive care unit help her survive, but it also strengthened her resolve to never leave her kids with the same scars of absence. They are still her pillars today, the unseen stage crew responsible for every public victory. Lourdes, who is fiercely independent and forging her own artistic career. The twins, Esther and Stella, growing into young women under her watch, reminding her every day that legacy is not built in charts or museums, but in the quiet courage passed from one generation to the next. Rocco, with his mother's fire but his father's grounding. David and Mercy, whose adoptions took her across borders and taught her that motherhood is defined by choice rather than biology. Then there is love, which is calmer and more stable than the flaming storms of her past. Since 2019, she has been associated with Ala Malik Williams, a man much younger than her, who was prepared to support her as a witness to her humanity, rather than as an accessory to her celebrity. Their relationship, which was put to the test during her near-death encounter in 2023, has become more about presence than passion. She has discovered a unique solace in his loyalty, the understanding that trust is not a luxury only young people can afford, and that even a heart scarred by loss can be held. Madonna views this late-season romance as a statement that love is for anyone who has the courage to continue choosing it, rather than a rejection of aging. However, the silent reality of aging remains beneath the dinners, the laughter, and the hand reaching for hers when the cameras are not there. Every sunrise at age 67 serves as a reminder that time is limited. The shadow of one day letting go is present in every embrace she receives from her kids. In her rare moments of openness, she has acknowledged that what scares her the most is not death per se, but rather the reverberation of her own early years, that one day her children may awaken to a silence too heavy to endure. She sees the priceless family dinners after lengthy rehearsals, the laughter that fills the hallways of her 26-room townhouse, the sight of her children gathered in simple stillness, and the brittle warmth of companionship that whispers, she is not alone, even if the world sees her wealth, her mansions, and her art collection. After decades of trying to reinvent herself, Madonna has discovered her most authentic stage in the roles she never practiced, but has worked the hardest to master: motherhood and the courage to love. However, despite her wealth and family, Madonna is unable to avoid the harshness of aging. She was once crowned the Queen of Pop, but now millions of people are examining her face, body, and decisions, refusing to let her age as she sees fit. Wrinkles are hailed as wisdom, and men her age are hailed as timeless. Her very survival has become a spectacle, and she has been ridiculed as desperate. "It's not the mirror that hurts," she said in a rare moment of openness. "It's the knowledge that everyone is observing me in it." The unseen burden of ageism and misogyny lurks behind every public appearance. It is a slow, gnawing pain that no amount of money can ease, a pressure that wears away day after day, more merciless than fame itself and more unrelenting than scandal. Nevertheless, the spirit of Madonna refuses to give up. She gets up early, does yoga and boxing, eats a macrobiotic diet, and takes good care of herself. Not to please a world that is always judging her, but to assert her own right to a full life. She told friends that the prize was not praise, but life itself, after her near-death experience in 2023. "I already win every day when I wake up," she remarked. Her scars, breathing rhythm, and survival itself all bear witness to the fact that dignity comes from facing time head-on rather than avoiding it. Because of this, the world respects her as a force as well as a singer. With over 300 million records sold, 44 #1 hits, and 6 tours that have made over $100 million each, she continues to be the best-selling female artist in history. Her greatest achievement, however, is found in the lives she has impacted away from the limelight, far beyond the charts and the crowns. Madonna has put her money and heart into one of the most vulnerable areas of the world. Through her Raising Malawi Foundation, thousands of kids who previously studied under trees are now seated in bright classrooms thanks to the more than a dozen schools she has constructed. She provided funding for the nation's first cutting-edge pediatric hospital, where mothers can now see their children flourish and recover rather than watch them deteriorate without treatment. Her dedication has been consistent, rather than a one-time act of celebrity charity. She goes back to Malawi year after year, strolling through the villages, calling the kids by name and hearing their tales. For them, she is just Mambo, mother, rather than the world's Queen of Pop. According to them, her legacy is measured in futures rewritten: a girl who aspires to be a doctor, a boy who dares to think he can be more than circumstance rather than in accolades or news headlines. The woman who once sang of rebellion now transforms that same fire into compassion, using her influence not only to provoke, but also to protect. This is Madonna's quiet side, the one that cameras hardly ever catch. As an anthem composed not in lyrics but in classrooms, hospital wards, and the laughter of children who would otherwise have been forgotten, her philanthropy is not distinct from her art. Rather, it is its continuation. A truth greater than Madonna's celebrity is revealed by her humanitarian endeavors. Power finds its greatest use in service rather than dominance. She has demonstrated that resilience involves more than just overcoming one's own obstacles. It also entails advocating for those who are unable to do so on their own. In this sense, her greatest stage might not be the arenas packed with millions of people, but rather the villages where a mother calls her Mambo with hope and a child whispers her name in gratitude. More than just a celebrity, Madonna is evidence that openly expressing resilience can lead to rebellion, and that compassion-driven rebellion has the power to transform not only music and culture but also people's lives. From losing her mother at the age of 5 to witnessing a generation of friends die of AIDS to almost dying in the intensive care unit at the age of 64, her life is a tragic symphony that will not end in silence. But she always gets back up, bruised but unbowed. What's left is a spirit that transforms every injury into testimony, every fall into resurrection, and every silence into song, not just a catalog of anthems, sold-out tours, or eye-catching headlines. And so her story goes on, a beacon forged in fire rather than a fairy tale refined by perfection. For the supporters who applauded, for the doubtful skeptics, for every soul battling aging, loss, and the crushing weight of expectations, she left behind a message that will never go away. As long as you are alive, you are not defeated. Madonna's journey serves as a reminder that resilience is the choice to rise with pain, to transform scars into symbols of survival, and to transform fragility into strength. If Madonna's music has ever moved you, show your appreciation by leaving a red heart in the comments section. Remember to like this video, so that more people can relate to her story. Which part of her journey most affected you? Tell us about it and whose story we should next celebrate.